One of them broke into his neighbor's house, drove to her bank, and withdrew cash from her account while she was still tied up inside. And what he did when he came back kept him on death row for 35 years. One of them raped his own 13-year-old niece and then blamed the murder on his brother. He spent nearly 50 years on death row before they finally carried out the sentence. And one of them sat in a jail cell 4 days after killing 2 men and laughed about it on camera. When asked about the victims and their families, he said, "F them." But only one of them got married 2 weeks before his execution. These are the prisoners executed in April 2026. Their crimes, their last meals, and their last words. But first, let us know where you are watching this from. James Ernest Hitchcock was 20 years old when he climbed through a window in his brother's house. His brother Richard had taken him in off the street 2 weeks earlier. This is what he did with that second chance. It was July 30th, 1976 in Winter Garden, Florida. That evening, James Hitchcock sat in his brother Richard's living room and watched television with the family until around 11 p.m. Nothing unusual, just a normal night. Then James left the house and headed into town, where he spent the next few hours drinking beer and smoking marijuana with friends. He came back around 2:30 in the morning, but he didn't use the front door. He climbed in through a dining room window, and then he walked down the hallway to the bedroom of Cynthia Driggers, Richard's 13-year-old stepdaughter. He raped her, and after he was done, Cindy told him she was hurt. She said she was going to tell her mother, and when he tried to stop her from leaving the room, she started yelling. So he grabbed her by the neck. He dragged her outside the house, still fighting, still yelling. In his own words, she started hollering, and when she wouldn't stop, he choked her again. He beat her, he hit her in the face, and he kept choking her until she went quiet. Then he shoved her body into some bushes, walked back inside, took a shower, climbed into bed, and went to sleep like it was any other night. When he woke up and noticed the family was realizing Cindy was gone, James went around trying to organize a search party to find her. He was out there playing the concerned uncle, trying to get neighbors to help look for the girl whose body he had personally shoved into the bushes a few hours earlier. He knew exactly where she was. He put her there. Police focused on James almost immediately, and on August 4th, he confessed. He laid out the entire night in his own words, step by step, how he came home drunk, how he entered through the window, what he did to Cindy, how he killed her. But even while confessing to everything, he still tried to twist the story. He told investigators that the sex was consensual, that a 13-year-old girl wanted it. But the autopsy destroyed that claim before it ever reached a courtroom. Cindy's had been recently torn. Sperm was found inside her body, and her face was covered in cuts and bruises around both eyes. There is nothing consensual about any of that. And there was something else. Cindy's sister Deborah later testified that before the murder, she and Cindy had confronted James about things he was doing to Cindy. According to Deborah, James told them he would rape and kill Cynthia. He said it out loud, and then he did exactly that. James was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery. But the trial is where this story gets even worse. Less than a year after the murder, James stood trial. And here is where he showed exactly who he really was. He recanted his entire confession, every word. He now told the jury that Cindy had let him into her room willingly, that she consented to sex with him. Remember, she was 13, while he was 20. The age of consent in Florida is 18, but it gets worse. James then pointed his finger directly at his own brother, Richard, the same man who had taken him in when he had nothing. He told the jury that after the sex, Richard walked in and caught them, that Richard flew into a rage and dragged Cindy outside, that Richard choked her to death, and that James only confessed to police because he was trying to protect his brother. Think about that for a second. He raped his brother's child, then he killed her, and then, in a courtroom, he tried to frame the one person in his life who had shown him kindness for the murder. That's a level of betrayal most people can't even wrap their heads around. But the jury saw right through it. His original confession was detailed, specific, and in his own words. The physical evidence matched it perfectly. And the story about Richard only appeared after James had weeks to sit in a cell and think about how to save himself. And then there was the letter. From jail, James had written to his own mother confessing to the killing. He put it in writing, and then he got on the stand and blamed his brother anyway. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, they found him guilty. The vote for death was 7-5, and the judge agreed. On February 11, 1977, James Hitchcock was sentenced to die in the electric chair. But that sentence would take almost 50 years to carry out. His case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, twice. The ruling even became a landmark decision that reshaped how capital cases were handled nationwide. He was resentenced a third time in 1993, and then the vote was 12-0, unanimous, and a fourth time in 1996 when the vote was 10-2. 4 separate juries heard this case. 4 separate times they said this man should die, and every single time James told the same story, that his brother did it, that he was only guilty of the sex. As if a 13-year-old is the lesser thing he's willing to admit to. And keeping James on death row for nearly 50 years cost Florida taxpayers far more than a sentence of life without parole ever would have. In Florida, the average execution costs an estimated 6 times more than life in prison. And James Hitchcock's case wasn't average. 4 trials, decades of appeals, 2 Supreme Court cases, and a family that had to relive the worst night of their lives every time a courtroom door opened. While James Hitchcock was cycling through courtrooms and filing appeals, Cindy Drigger's family was stuck in a loop of their own. Her younger sister, Lynn Cobb, was only 16 months younger than Cindy. She was there the day it happened, and for nearly 5 decades, she watched the case drag through the system with no end in sight.
For me, it was just felt like it was never going to end, and we just kept doing it over and over again.
She described the aftermath of the murder as a blur. Cindy's cousin, Jeannie Meadows, spent years going to Tallahassee, pressing officials for answers. She said the decades had taken a toll on the older members of the family that most people couldn't understand.
2 people in my family, at night, when they lay their head down on their pillow, you know what their prayer is? That they live longer than Hitchcock does.
And then there was Cindy's mother, Judy. After 50 years of waiting, she said something that every parent in this situation has probably thought but never said out loud. I just hope that it goes through. I hope God forgives me for saying this, but he needs to die. For nearly 50 years, James sat on death row at Florida State Prison. He was one of the longest-serving inmates on the row. And then, on March 31st, 2026, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant. The execution was set for April 30th. After 49 years and 9 months on death row, James Hitchcock was about to face the end. On the morning of his execution, James woke up at 4:45 a.m. According to a prison spokesman, he was compliant throughout the day. He met with a cousin, but not with a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, James Hitchcock had chicken, salad, ice cream, pie, and a soda. At the end of the day, he was brought into the execution chamber, where the curtain went up at 6 p.m. James Hitchcock lay strapped to a gurney with 2 IV lines inserted into his arms. He was asked if he had any final words. He said, "Just to say goodbye to my friend, Joshua. Thanks for all you've done." Then he lifted his head toward a man sitting in the front row of the gallery. The man raised his hand, and those were the last words James Hitchcock ever spoke. Not a word about Cindy, no apology, no remorse. After 50 years, his last breath was a goodbye to a friend. The warden gave the signal, and the drugs were administered. At 6:12 p.m., 12 minutes after the injection began, James Ernest Hitchcock was pronounced dead. He was 70 years old. James Hitchcock spent 50 years saying he didn't do it, but the next man executed that month spent 16 years saying he did, on camera, smiling. And then, 2 weeks before his execution, he and his cousin said it was all a lie. On June 19, 2008, just after 1 a.m., a man riding his bicycle home from work down a quiet residential street in Garland, Texas, saw something near a small recording studio, 2 bodies lying in the road. He stopped, rode to a nearby fire station, and flagged down the crew. Within minutes, paramedics confirmed what the cyclist already knew. Both men were dead. Stephen Swan was 26 and Matthew Butler was 28. Both were Christian music producers. They had been working late at their own studio, just the 2 of them, in the middle of the night. Stephen had been shot in the head and in the chest. Matthew had been shot multiple times as well. They were found lying in the street outside the building, with nobody else around, and no witnesses. Just 2 men dead, and whoever did this already gone. So, who would target 2 Christian music producers in the middle of the night in suburban Garland? A 19-year-old named James Broadnax. And he wasn't exactly quiet about it. Later that same day, James and his cousin Demarius Cummings rolled up to a southeast Dallas apartment where James had been crashing with relatives. And instead of keeping his mouth shut, James started bragging. Told people in the room he had just hit a lick. That's street slang for pulling off a robbery. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out Stephen Swan's driver's license and showed it off like a trophy to everyone in the room. But what he didn't mention was that they only got $2 from the whole robbery. $2. Then he and Demarius walked out the door, got into Stephen's Ford Crown Victoria, and told everyone they were going to sell it. 15 minutes later, one of the people sitting in that apartment saw a news broadcast about a double homicide in Garland. She recognized the details immediately, and she picked up the phone and called the Garland Police Department. And it didn't take long for police to find him. That evening, officers in Texarkana, roughly 150 miles away, spotted a Ford Crown Victoria in a high-crime neighborhood. But when they ran the plates, the registration came back to a Cadillac, not a Ford. They pulled the car over, and James gave them his name. Multiple warrants came back active, and he was arrested on the spot. But here's where this case stops being a routine robbery murder and turns into something else entirely. After he was brought back to Dallas, James agreed to sit down with multiple local television reporters, on camera, in the Dallas County Jail. His cousin Demarius did his own interview. He admitted to the robbery, but said he wasn't the shooter. James, he said, pulled the trigger, and James agreed. But the way he said it is what sealed his fate.
Say, let's hop on the train. Let's go to downtown Garland, you know what I'm saying? And we gonna rob somebody. Let's go out there where the rich white folks stay, you know what I'm saying? Rob one of them, you know what I'm saying? So we get out there, and we robbed them. I them.
How much
I popped they.
What did you think when the police caught up to you?
What I think? When they hit the lights, I said, damn, and started laughing, you know what I'm saying? Just like I'm doing now. And looked them in their face with a big smirk. Y'all ain't got on me, dog, but I do want to see the evidence.
What do you think's gonna happen to you now?
Whatever they throw at me. Hopefully the death penalty.
Hopefully?
Yeah.
Why do you hope?
Cause they give me life, I'ma kill everybody else. Straight up.
You kill 2 young men now.
Better they life than mine.
Do you have any remorse? None whatsoever.
Do it look like it?
I just can't believe you're killing people and you're laughing about it.
Yeah. Just like when they stick that damn in my one, they gonna laugh at me. Look at that dumb motherfucker. You know how y'all is, dog. Fuck. Just like I said. Fuck family too. Both of them.
2 men were dead. Their families were planning funerals, and the guy who said he killed them was sitting in a jail cell, smiling on camera and daring the state of Texas to execute him. And Texas took him up on that offer. At trial in 2009, his defense argued he'd been high on PCP during the murders and was still under the influence when he gave those interviews. But every witness who dealt with James that week said the same thing. He was lucid, sharp, and fully aware. The jury had watched the interviews themselves. They could see his eyes, they could hear his voice, and they could decide for themselves whether that was a man who didn't know what he was saying. But prosecutors went further. They introduced more than 40 pages of James's handwritten rap lyrics into evidence. Lines like, "I am and body bag 'em, send them to the mayor, then I the whole country, send the press, the paper." The state argued those lyrics showed exactly who James was. They compared him to predators on Animal Planet, chomping at the bit to kill. The jury convicted James Garfield Broadnax of capital murder and sentenced him to death. After hearing that interview, what would you have done if you were on that jury? Let us know in the comments. His cousin Demarius got life without parole under Texas's law of parties, and he's still serving that sentence to this day. But the story doesn't end with the conviction. Because weeks before the state of Texas was scheduled to execute him, James Broadnax got married on death row. After the conviction, James was sent to the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, and for the next 16 years, his appeals went nowhere. Then, with 42 days left before his execution date, the case took a sharp turn. James's attorneys filed a brand new appeal, and attached to it was a signed sworn declaration from Demarius Cummings. The same Demarius who had gone on camera in 2008 and said he wasn't the shooter.
I want them to know I didn't kill him. I didn't kill nobody. I didn't kill a husband or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Now, 17 years later, he was saying the opposite.
That it was me, you know, that I was a kid. And bro just stood in my place with him getting a death penalty. That should have been me. I gotta play this remorseful role. I gotta make it seem like I'm the one that was remorseful, that didn't do it. He was the one that was the shooter.
The appeal also highlighted DNA evidence that had been available since the original trial. Demarius's DNA was found on the grip and the trigger of the murder weapon, and James's DNA was not on either. Around the same time, rappers Travis Scott, Young Thug, T.I., and Killer Mike filed briefs with the U.S. Supreme Court arguing that using James's rap lyrics as evidence of future dangerousness had been racially motivated. The case exploded into national headlines, but the families of the victims were not moved. Matthew Butler's mother went on social media and called the cousin's confession a Hail Mary pass and all a lie. Stephen Swan's mother had written to the court years earlier, urging them to set the execution date. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied the appeal. The execution would go forward as scheduled. And then, 2 weeks before his execution date, James got married. His bride was a 31-year-old British woman named Tiana Krasnicki. She was a master's student in international human rights law, who had first written to James while researching racial bias in Texas death penalty cases. She said what started as academic research turned into something deeper. They got engaged during a prison visit. She then left her life in London, left her 9-year-old daughter with the girl's father, and moved to Houston to be closer to a man she had never touched. The wedding took place on April 14th behind glass with no physical contact. Texas does not allow contact visits with death row inmates. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. She said her vows, and then it was time to go. She had never touched him, not once. When asked what her family thought, she said, "No one's happy." Texas stopped honoring special last meal requests back in 2011 after a death row inmate named Lawrence Russell Brewer ordered an enormous spread of food and then refused to eat a single bite of it. Since then, every condemned inmate in Texas gets the same meal as every other prisoner on the unit. Stephen Swan was 26 years old and Matthew Butler was 28. They made Christian music together in a small recording studio on a residential street in Garland, Texas. On a Thursday morning in June 2008, somebody shot them both and left them in the road. Over $2. James Broadnax spent 16 years saying he did it. He went on camera and bragged about it. He laughed about it. He asked the state to kill him for it. And then, when the execution date finally came, the only other person who was there that night said it was all a lie, that James had taken the fall for something he didn't do. But the courts didn't buy it. The families didn't buy it. And on April 30th, 2026, the state of Texas went ahead with the execution. On the morning of April 30th, James Broadnax was transferred from the Polunsky unit in Livingston to the Walls unit in Huntsville, where Texas carries out its executions. He spent his final hours in a holding cell next to the execution chamber. Shortly after 6 p.m., he was brought into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. An IV line was inserted into his arm. Witnesses were brought into the viewing room, including his wife Tiana, who had married him behind glass just 16 days earlier. He was asked if he had a final statement. He looked at the witnesses and spoke. "To the family, I prayed for years that any of my choices would create heaviness in your heart and burdens on your spirits," he said. "I prayed to God for your forgiveness. Despite what you think about me, I hope to God that prayer was answered." Then his tone shifted. "But no matter what you think about me, Texas got it wrong. I'm innocent. The facts of my case should speak for itself, period. Let this moment be what finally sparks the revolution that will be televised. None of it was worth it." He turned to Tiana. "Queen, I love you. My promise still stands. It always will. Keep fighting. Stay strong. Put God first. Never stop believing. I love you forever and a day. Peace, love, and light. That is what I stand for. God bless you all." The drug started flowing, and as it entered his veins, James was still talking. He urged his supporters to keep fighting. "Don't give up," he said. Then, mid-sentence, a gasp. He shook his head briefly. And then all movement stopped. His wife Tiana pressed against the witness room glass, crying out, "I love you," as he lost consciousness. She had to be assisted out of the viewing area by officials. James Garfield Broadnax was pronounced dead at 6:47 p.m. He was 37 years old. The last case in this video is actually the first execution carried out in April. On the 21st, Florida executed Chadwick Willacy. In 1990, Chadwick broke into his next-door neighbor's home in Palm Bay, Florida. She was 56 years old and had been a widow for exactly 2 months. She wasn't supposed to be home, but when she walked in and found him there, he attacked her. He tied her up, and then he left. He took her ATM card, drove her dead husband's car to her bank, and withdrew cash from her account while she was still inside that house. Then he came back. And what he did when he returned is the reason the state of Florida put a needle in his arm 35 years later. Her name was Marla Sather. She was 56, a mother of 3, and her husband had died of cancer just 2 months earlier. She was still adjusting to life alone. Marlis had just spent a day with her family at her son John's home near Orlando. It was his 32nd birthday. They ate homemade chicken and dumplings and cheesecake, and when it was time for Marlis to drive the hour back to Palm Bay, John said goodbye to his mother. "I said, 'I love you, Mom,' and she said, 'I love you too, John.'" Those were the last words he ever said to her. Chadwick Willacy lived right next door. He was 22. He had moved to Palm Bay from New York. His record was minor, a few drug offenses, nothing violent. He had mowed her lawn before. They had argued about what he charged, but she knew him, and she always waved to him in the driveway. And that proximity is what made this crime possible. He knew her routine. He knew when she left. He knew when she would be back. September 5th was supposed to be a normal Wednesday where she would be gone until evening. But she came home early. That day, Marlis left Harris Corporation during her lunch break and drove home to her house on Jarvis Street. She walked through the front door and found Chadwick inside, going through her things. He looked up but didn't run. He didn't panic. Instead, he bludgeoned her with a hammer and a squeegee. He bound her wrists and ankles with wire and duct tape so she couldn't move. And then he ripped a cord from an iron and choked her with such force that a portion of her skull was physically dislodged. She was still alive, but she couldn't fight back. She couldn't escape. And Chadwick wasn't done. What came next is what separates this case from almost anything else you'll ever hear. He went through her things methodically. He took her ATM card and her PIN. He grabbed the keys to her late husband's car. And then he drove to her bank and withdrew $200 from her account while she was tied up inside that house, while she was still breathing. After the bank, he came back and spent the next hours moving stolen items from her house to his own next door. And then he came back to finish it. Chadwick went through the house and disabled the smoke detectors, every single one. Then he went to the garage and grabbed a gas can. He carried it to where Marlis was lying and doused her body with gasoline. He found an oscillating fan from the guest room and placed it at her feet, angled to feed oxygen to what was coming. And then he struck several matches. He set her on fire while she was still alive. Marlis Sather did not die from the beating. She did not die from the flames. Medical examiner Dr. Charles Wickham confirmed that soot was recovered from her trachea. She died from inhaling the smoke of her own burning body. She was conscious when that match was lit. And Chadwick Willacy walked out the door and went home. When Marlis didn't return to work after lunch, her employer called the family. The next day, her son-in-law, Denning Loveridge, drove over to check on her. On the back porch, he found a shotgun and several electronic items just sitting there, waiting to be collected. He went inside, and he found his mother-in-law. On the ground, her ankles bound and an electric cord around her neck. After this, the investigation moved fast. Detective George Santiago led the case. Chadwick's fingerprints were found on the fan at Marlis's feet. His fingerprints were on the gas can. Witnesses had seen a man matching his description near the house and driving Marlis's car that same day. And the ATM security photos put him at her bank with her dead husband's car in the frame. But the break that sealed it came from somewhere no one expected. Chadwick's own girlfriend. Marissa Walcott was cleaning up around the house when she found something in his wastebasket. A woman's check register. She didn't know whose it was, but something felt wrong, so she called the police. Officers recognized it immediately. It belonged to Marlis Sather. They arrested Chadwick, and when they searched his home, they found Marlis's property inside. Her jewelry, her coins, and they found clothing with blood on it, blood that was consistent with her type. When police first questioned him, he denied everything. Then, when confronted with the evidence, his story changed. He admitted to being inside the house when it happened, but he claimed someone else killed Marlis. However, that person was cleared. He was at work, and Chadwick had argued with Marlis over what she paid him to mow her lawn. Was that his motive? The jury heard all of it. The fingerprints, the timeline, the stolen items in his house, the blood on his clothes. And after everything was laid out in front of them, they found Chadwick Willacy guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, burglary, robbery, and arson. They recommended death by a vote of 9-3. During sentencing, Chadwick asked the court to consider his age, 22, and that he had no significant history of prior criminal activity. The court considered it, and they sentenced him to death anyway. And then the waiting began. Chadwick Willacy spent more than 34 years on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. He was 22 when he went in, and he was 58 when it all came to an end. He wanted to know if lethal injection hurts, if he would feel any pain, so his lawyers filed a request on his behalf, asking the state for documents about how the drugs were being administered. The state never answered. Instead, 1 week later, Governor DeSantis signed his death warrant. His execution was scheduled for April 21st, 2026. But Chadwick wasn't spending his final days fighting for his own life. He was fighting for someone else's. Just 2 weeks before his execution, Willacy appeared on Zoom from Florida State Prison, not to fight his own case, to testify on behalf of another death row inmate named Rafael Andres, convicted of strangling a waitress with a rice cooker power cord and setting her apartment on fire. Chadwick told the judge that Rafael was a peacekeeper who broke up fights in the yard, that Rafael had helped him with appealing his conviction and sentence. Rafael looked at him through the screen and said, "If you get to heaven before me, I will see you there." 2 men on death row, both convicted of strangling a woman and setting her on fire, calling each other brother. Then, on April 21st, Chadwick's final day came. That morning, he woke up at 5 a.m. He received visits from his mother, 2 sisters, and a cousin. For his last meal, Chadwick requested chicken, tater tots, ice cream, and pie. The curtain to the execution chamber went up at the scheduled 6 p.m. time, and the lethal injection got underway 2 minutes later after Chadwick made a brief statement. He apologized to his own family and friends and urged his brothers on the row to stay strong. He maintained his innocence, saying that he would never kill his friend. To the victim's family, I hope this brings you peace. If it does, that's good, he said, but this is not right. Shortly after the lethal injection began, a warden shook Chadwick and shouted his name, but there was no response. His skin began to turn gray, and a medic eventually entered the chamber to examine Chadwick. He was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. Chadwick Willacy was 58 years old. This concludes all executions carried out in April 2026. Subscribe if you want to see more cases like these, and tell us in the comments which case is still sitting in your head right now.